Good evening, ex-Winterview. Back with a brief dialogue on confidence. How to be confident. Self-improvement. Just kidding. We don't improve the self around these parts. There is no self. But seriously, confidence is a question that comes up time and time again. I get it almost every day. How to be confident. How can I be more certain or confident in myself, or in what do I place confidence? Excellent question, and somehow I will link it back to non-duality, enlightenment, the self, etc. Cleverly. Such is my way, my mastery. Okay, enough grandiosity. Let us start with the problem with a lack of confidence. The problem with a lack of confidence, of course, as you probably could have guessed, is a mind game, a problem of the mind. And, of course, it's a problem of reference. We know from other dialogues, other brief dialogues, that the mind loves its references, reference points, benchmarks, and so on. So the problem of confidence is no different. But in what does one place confidence to feel an ongoing or a continuous sense of security and certainty in life? Is it possible? Can one do it if there is no self, as has been suggested? Then whom or what would indeed be confident? Who or what would place what on what to be confident? And so on and so forth. Let us begin. Let us start with the usual ways that people try to feel confident and work our way backwards. Most commonly, at least in Western culture, and I could speak for Eastern cultures, probably, that confidence is first and foremost, and this might sound a bit weird, something you might not have thought of before, is an absence of agitation. What do you mean, Winterview, an absence of agitation? Well, let's look at it this way. As the feeling of uncertainty arises, you will notice a concomitant feeling of physical and mental agitation, perhaps an anxiety, if you'd like to call it that. Doesn't really matter what label you give it. A distress of sorts in the body. The agitation is a discomfort of uncertainty. Am I on the right track? Even the metaphor to be on the right track gives one a sense of how that uncertainty arises. In primal times, when being on the right track was vital to one's survival out in the wilderness, one felt confident. This track leads home, back to the village. This track leads to water. This track leads to the enemy village. Do not go down that track. And so on and so forth. So to be on the right track is a very apt metaphor in the realm of confidence. So to feel like you're on the right path in some way is marked in the body by a distinct absence of any feelings of agitation, annoyance, irritation, and disturbances of thought, doubt, etc., etc. So another way to describe this is a feeling of certainty, that it's so certain, in fact, that one doesn't even feel much about it at all. Negligible response or reaction within the physiology and the mind. But uncertainty does arise. Lack of confidence does arise. And for some people, it's chronic. It's a pervasive sense of not being on the right track, or always feeling like they're doing something wrong. and so on and so forth. So that comes to the next point of benchmarking. To be able to do something wrong, one must have a concept of right or correct, and then you must be able to judge yourself in reference to that benchmark. And of course, if you're wrong or off track or uncertain, etc. and so forth, you've got a reference point that is unobtainable or currently not being obtained. We could go in and look at all the different reference points, but there's really infinite, and you could explore, let's say, work as a good example of how to feel a lack of confidence. When you start your first day at work, there's often a feeling of nervousness. Am I even sitting in the right seat? Am I taking my breaks at the right time? Am I doing the job properly that my employer expected of me? And so forth. And after you've been there for a few months, there's a lack of agitation. You know what you do. You know what your role is. So the narrative kicks in at a point. And then we know about story. We've talked about that in other brief dialogues. When the story is fluid and the self is well integrated into the story, then the feeling of confidence is there, or, as I prefer to say, the absence of agitation. The story just seems to make sense, and your role in the story is secure. The next thing I like to look at with this lack of confidence is some people have the feeling or the idea that to have confidence, one must be worthy of that confidence. And in the domain of worth, that starts to get into desirability and things that people try and do to enhance or increase desirability. So of course this requires conceptualization of a personal self who can or cannot be desirable, and then we need to figure out all the attributes that make that person more desirable. So in Western culture, we all know these ones: wealth, fame, being good looking, being handsome, being pretty, being witty, and so forth, being very cool, being hip, being of the moment, being so edgy that it hurts, and all that cool stuff people seem to think that it will imbue that self-concept with a stability and a confidence. Of course, what is often not recognized, it's a very fragile domain to maintain your confidence. So, for example, if you place a lot of weight on your appearance for your confidence, then you are subject to every nuance of your appearance. So should you lose your looks in an accident or put on weight, or suddenly you find that the fashion that you like is out of style, you suddenly plunge into the depths of having a lack of confidence. So we need to be cautious about building up the self with external props. Some people prefer the more inward journey, the inner sense of quiet confidence. And this means they turn away from the world, so to speak, and they look towards what they might call their inner space. Not that there is such a thing, but let's just pretend there is. And they feel a quiet confidence that they don't need stuff in the outside world. And what that usually means, in conceptual terms, at least as far as the mind is concerned, is that they've just surrendered the attachments to all the bells and whistles and trinkets of the world and just kind of said, you know what, I just actually don't care about all that stuff anymore. And for people who do that, they're often rewarded with a feeling of confidence, a reduction in the agitation in the body and the mind. So that's what we call confidence. But there is one point of reference that I've talked about over and over eternally. That is your very alive awakeness, the very life itself. When Jesus was said to have said, "I am the life," he wasn't kidding. That was a literal statement, not an allegory. The closest thing that one can say to an accurate description of liberation, or at the point of liberation, if you like, is "I am the life." And that makes total sense when there is no concept of the personal self. Having a life, all there is the life. So this life, this raw aliveness, this awakeness, this prior to the appearance, this ever-present-ness of one's existence doesn't come or go. Nothing impacts on it. Nothing tarnishes it. It contains all experience, all phenomenon, without judgment. It's a seamless. What's the word I like? It's fine. I've used that before. It's a total open spaciousness. Hard to describe. Reaching for words to describe it, but can't find any. Anyway, that is the ultimate point of reference, you might say. That is the one thing that doesn't come or go. And often people find that when they meditate and quieten the mind down and surrender the interest in the world, for example, they might feel like they sense that stillness, that inner stillness. They get a little taster of it sometimes when there's not much going on in the experience. These little tasters sometimes remind the mind, sometimes they silence the mind quite profoundly, whether it's accidentally or on purpose. The mind going silent often loses all conceptualization ability, and we describe this as a satori. I think that's a Zen term, but you don't have to use that term if you don't like it. It's just a sort of it stuns the mind, you might say, into silence. And in that silence, often people will report a confidence and a very different flavor of confidence to the worldly confidence. This is the confidence that one was never born and one will never die. There's an eternalness about that confidence, that utter essentialness of one's existence, which is immutable. And that is you might say, the ultimate confidence, but that unfortunately cannot be realized. The mind cannot realize that. It's not something that can be described or arrived at. It has more of an isness about it. It just is the underlay, you might say, not to be confused with the Mexican word to hurry up. So that type of satori flavor of confidence that I finally mentioned there has a real silencing effect on the mind. So what we find, interestingly, is that when the mind is silent or unable to grasp onto anything, free of conceptualization or free from the burden of conceptualization, you might even say, it what's the word? I can't think of it. Anyway, it the confidence that I am arises naturally. Not even arises, that makes it seem like it sort of comes from somewhere and lands. It's realized that it was always there. It never went anywhere. And everything else suddenly takes its place in a relative way to that stillness, to that silence. The world is seen as more of a wonder, a theme park, not to be taken too seriously, perhaps, is often the report. And occasionally you get this same flavour with people who've had near-death experiences, where they've had a serious operation or an accident and perhaps being clinically dead for a few seconds or maybe a minute or so, and have reportedly had an experience where they were outside the body and then aware of their death in a way, and then back into the body and awake and alive again. And these people very frequently report a profound renewed confidence and often become very joyful and full of life as a result of this, as seeing through the veneer or the play of the world as not too serious, really. So we can see now, after I've gone through all these models of confidence, that in a more global sense, the more identified with the seriousness of the world and the trinkets of the world, the confidence seems to be more fragile, harder to obtain, more conceptual, if you like. And as the world falls away in its importance, as the edges and boundaries of the world blur, as conceptualizing slows down, stops, or comes grinding to a halt, the confidence spontaneously arises. Now, the reason I suggested earlier that confidence is better described as an absence of agitation is because when the mind falls silent in these wonderful Satori experiences, that there is a pronounced absence of agitation. There's a real sense of everything is as it should be. There's nothing wrong with the world, and that's the ultimate form, if you like, of confidence, that there is nothing wrong, nothing could be wrong with this world. One's behaviors and actions and decisions, supposed decisions, are all perfectly okay. They're all aligned with perhaps some mystical greater plan for the universe. It doesn't really matter what concept you give it. It's seen as impersonal. It's seen as it doesn't matter anymore. There's a real sense of it not mattering. So that's a sense that the world is falling away, or attachment to the world, you might even add, is falling away. And there suddenly is that pronounced absence of agitation or confidence. So for the average man on the street looking for a bit of confidence, what can we glean from this brief dialogue? Well, first and foremost, if you're putting your confidence in the external appearance, what you're essentially doing is putting it on concepts. Your confidence is highly conceptual and susceptible to the flux and trials and changes of the concepts. On the other hand, as one relaxes, withdraws importance from the concepts and ideas of the world, one will naturally find that the absence of agitation is more pronounced, more ever-present, or you could say as an increase in the feelings of confidence. And the confidence it's a funny thing. It's suddenly realized that even so-called poor behavior or mistakes, gaffes, whoopsies, all those things are all okay in a way. There's an okayness about one's behavior, rather than having to be perfect all the time and behave well and do the right thing, which is a highly conceptual endeavor and really, really stressful at the end of the day. It's much easier to be very at peace with one's behavior, the full spectrum of one's behavior, such as is more natural, more realistic in a way. So during the course of a day, you're not permanently amazingly awesome. You make silly errors, mistakes, you're forgetful, you are limited in many ways. This is just the human organism playing out its limitations, and sometimes it's quite brilliant and very clever and deservedly needs recognition and applause at times. But that's not a reason for confidence. That's just that's just the skill of the organism. So we be gentle with these organisms, these bodies, these body minds that need a bit of love. They're not perfect. You can laugh at your own mistakes and your own foibles, your own limitations, and take a more compassionate attitude as well to others around you, and you'll find that your confidence increases. You'll find that people who are very fixed and rigid in their approaches to confidence will come at you guns a-blazing, trying to suggest that your behavior is inappropriate or less than acceptable, and they're trying to bolster their own confidence. And you'll see that little game very frequently play out, especially in workplaces where you'll have the people who are always, blowing their own trumpets and pointing out the mistakes of others. You'll see that little game play out, and now you'll know what's going on there. It's just clinging to the concepts of how they can feel that absence of agitation. So those individuals are forever pushing away against this awful agitation they don't want to feel or admit to. where if you really want to have confidence, you're not afraid anymore, not afraid of your own behavior, not afraid of the world anymore, not afraid of what might be coming around the corner. So, I hope this was somewhat informative and maybe helpful dialogue. I hope my lack of coffee was not too apparent during the dialogue. Once again, this is for my dear friend Annastacey. But however, anyone's welcome to comment below. Thank you for your time.